mission of the Russian Chamberlain, Novotsitov, to Paris was drawing to a close at about the same time, in consequence of the union of the Republic of Genoa with the French Empire. It is well known that peace was not the real object of this mission. The Emperor Alexander, who had just formed the new coalition with Mr. Pitt, had not the least desire to prevent a war in which, with chivalrous ardor, he was only too willing to engage, with the prospect before him of the satisfaction of limiting the power of France. The mission given to his envoy had no other object than to assist the dilatory policy of the Austrian government and to help Austria to gain time, which she deemed necessary for the completion of her preparations. When Austria had thought herself ready and believed that the right time had come, she had thrown off the mask in the expedition of taking the emperor by surprise. In the midst of his preparations for his expedition against England, she had marched her troops suddenly into the Bavarian territory. On September 23, 1805, the Moniteur announced that on the 21st of the same month, the Emperor of Germany, without preliminary negotiations or explanations and without any declaration of war, had invaded Bavaria. At the end of the month's journey, which Napoleon had just made on the coast, he had been obliged to renounce in the presence of the events which we have related, both the plan of an invasion of England and that of breaking up the camp at Bologna, casting a glance of regret on the prey which had been torn from his grasp. He marched the army which had been collected on the seacoast to the Rhine, and in official order announced the new destination of the army, which from that moment was called the Great Army. The emperor's plan was to march his various corps at full speed into the center of Germany, so as to prevent the junction of the Russians and Austrians, and in the hope of giving battle to the Allies separately. The expedition to Ireland became out of the question, and Marshal Augereau, who was commanding the corps destined for this expedition, received orders to proceed to the Rhine. This corps, which was only to arrive a fortnight after the others, formed the rear guard. The emperor wrote to Monsieur Otto, his representative in Bavaria, that the Bavarian troops would have to join the troops commanded by Bernadotte and to follow his movements. These troops, together with those of Württemberg, Baden, and several other German principalities who declared in favor of France, added about 40,000 men to the French effective forces. Augereau's army covered the distance which separated it from the scene of war with a rapidity and a precision worthy of the Roman armies. On the 23rd of September, the emperor proceeded to the military school, where the prefect of police with the municipal corporations handed the keys of the city over to him, which he returned as though to entrust them to their keeping. He then went to the Senate, there to denounce the triple coalition of Austria, Russia, and England, and announced his departure for the army. As a matter of prudence, he had reorganized the National Guard, which he charged with the maintenance of order in the interior and with the defense of our frontiers and coasts, under the command of 4 senators, 4 generals. He had moreover summoned to active service a certain class of retired soldiers who were still fit to carry arms, granting them various advantages. Prince Joseph was to preside over the Senate and the other councils of the government during the absence of Napoleon. On the 24th, the emperor left Paris, accompanied by the Empress Josephine, whom he had left behind at Strasbourg, with her court and Monsieur de Talleyrand. He arrived at Ettlingen, a castle belonging to the Elector of Baden, on October 1st. The old Elector, accompanied by his sons and grandsons, had gone there to receive the emperor and to seal their alliance with him. Napoleon was at Louisbourg the next day. The Elector of Württemberg, who was awaiting him there, gave him a brilliant reception. This prince, surrounded by the whole of his court, had at his side his second son and the Electress, the eldest daughter of George III. He offered his own apartment to the emperor, and though he was not generally considered a very affectionate father, everything in this home wore a most patriarchal aspect, the stuffs which covered the furniture being in part the work of his children. The emperor's arrival had put a stop to the elector's hesitations. He signed a treaty with the French sovereign by which Württemberg undertook to supply the French army with a corps of troops, with horses, wagons, and artillery. Napoleon spent a week at Louisbourg, the object of constant attention and respect. He even accepted an invitation to dine in public with the whole electoral family to please the elector. The second son of this prince, Prince Paul, showed himself most attentive to the emperor, being always at his side and accompanied him on horseback on all of his excursions. Prince Paul had recently married a princess of Saxe-Hildburghausen. This same prince, whose sentiments afterwards changed greatly, for what reason I do not know, at the time of war with Prussia in 1806, sadly left Stuttgart without his father's knowledge, and went to offer his services to the King of Prussia, who gave him a command to his army. He was amongst the number of Prussian officers who were made prisoners at the Battle of Jena. The emperor took no revenge on him for this disloyalty beyond refusing to see him, and sent him back out of regard to the king, his father, who had him imprisoned in a fortress. The Elector of Bavaria, who had in vain asked Austria to be allowed to remain neutral, had fled from his capital on the approach of the Austrian army and took refuge at Würzburg. Napoleon only saw him at Linz, where the prince came to see him. The Elector returned to Munich after Bernadotte's army had driven the Austrians out, which took place about a fortnight after the opening of the campaign. The emperor received the Austrian general Gillet at Linz. He was one of the Austrian generals who had been made prisoner at Ulm, but whom Napoleon had restored to liberty. He came with a request for a suspension of hostilities with a view to opening negotiations for peace. Napoleon asked him if he was vested with sufficient powers to treat for peace then and there. The Austrian general answered that his master could agree to nothing without having first consulted his ally, the Emperor of Russia. Such a step could have no other object than to delay the onward march of the French army. Napoleon, in his answer to a letter from the Emperor of Austria, brought by Monsieur Gillet, said that he was wrong to refer to the Emperor of Russia, who had not the same interest as they had in the war, that this war was only a caprice on the part of the Russian sovereign, whilst for France and Austria it was a struggle which absorbed all their means and all their faculties, that he, Napoleon, was disposed to settle the dispute with the greatest promptitude, but that he could not hide from the Emperor Francis the fear which had risen from the delays and the intrigues of the bitterness of which, considering the past, was still fresh in his memory. After some hesitation before the crossing of the Inn by the Austrians, the Elector of Bavaria had accepted the French alliance and had added his troops to our army. There remained Prussia, which, owing to the personal feeling of the king, was observing neutrality. The passing of Bernadotte's corps through the Principality of Ansbach gave the war party in Berlin the desired pretext for persuading the king to assume a menacing attitude. In consequence of this, Minister Hardenberg listened with very bad grace to the explanations which were given him about the march of his corps of the French army. The sudden appearance of the Emperor Alexander in Berlin finally triumphed over the irresolution of the king, and a treaty of alliance was signed between the two monarchs at Potsdam on November 3rd. It was sealed by oaths taken on the tomb of the great Frederick, a scene which had been prepared by the Queen. The king, however, caused certain reservations which he considered prudent, on account of the success of the French army, and notably by the capitulation of Ulm, a triumph which till then had been unparalleled in the history of our armies, and to be inserted in this treaty. I will mention the fight at Günzburg, where the emperor lost a very distinguished officer who had been his aide-de-camp. This officer, nephew of General Lequeux, had incurred Napoleon's displeasure by his caustic tongue and by the utterance of certain sarcasms against influential persons who had disposed the emperor against him. Colonel Lequeux was killed during the attack on the bridge at Günzburg, fighting bravely at the end of the 59th Infantry Regiment. Napoleon mourned the loss of this officer and ordered all the troops assembled at Günzburg to be present at his funeral. The emperor removed his headquarters to Augsburg, the center of his operations, and stopped 3 days in the city to await the effect of the movement of the different corps and to occupy himself with the important details in the administration of the army. He had the town protected against any attempt at a surprise and established a general depot of arms, magazines, and ambulances. He ordered all the Austrian artillery, which had been captured at Ulm, to be transported there. The emperor stayed in the palace of the former elector of Treves, who did the honors of his episcopal palace with the Princess Cunegonde, his sister. He was the prince of the House of Saxony, who, after the loss of his electorate, which had been suppressed by the Treaty of Luneville, had retired to the bishopric of Augsburg, amalgamating the title of this see with that of the elector of Treves. The income from this see and various pensions, including one of 100,000 florins, enabled him to live at Augsburg in a very honorable manner. He was anxious to show, by the cordial hospitality with which he received the emperor, how grateful he was to him for the comforts which he enjoyed in his old age, comforts which he owed to the influence which Napoleon had formerly exercised on the secularizations. The battles which preceded and followed upon the taking of Ulm brought after them results of the highest importance. On October 11th, General Dupont, having arrived at the village of Haslach, with 2 regiments of infantry and a brigade of cavalry, attacked one of the corps which were leaving Ulm, and which General Mack was endeavoring to rescue from this place to march them onto the Tyrol and Bohemia. General Dupont sustained during the whole day of the 11th an unequal fight of 7,000 men against 25,000, dispersed the enemy, captured 2,000 prisoners, and by audacious tactics prevented the march of the enemy to Bohemia. Who could then have thought that the career of this general, called to so high a military destiny, would have ended 3 years later in so deplorable a manner? The other columns, which had escaped from Ulm, met with a similar fate at Elbeck, Neusheim, Lordlingen, and before Ulm itself. The investment of this place began by the seizure of the bridge and the Abbey of Elchingen. All these feats of arms were carried out in the worst weather imaginable. The soldiers, up to their knees in mud, a prey to privations of all kinds, were reanimated by the sight of the emperor, himself drenched, harassed, and covered with mud. I can remember my stupefaction on looking at the sinuous ramparts of the village of Elchingen, rising in an amphitheater above the Danube, surrounded by wall gardens and houses rising one above the other. These gardens and houses, filled with troops, and from which constant firing proceeded, were topped by the vast buildings of the fortified abbey, which was vigorously defended by formidable artillery. Marshal Ney won his title of Duke of Elchingen there, and fully deserved it. We spent 5 days at the Abbey of Elchingen in almost absolute starvation. The emperor used to leave it every morning to go to the camp before Ulm, where he used to spend the day and sometimes the night. The French army had become master of the heights which commanded Ulm. The emperor had some shells fired into the town and sent a summons to General Mack, commander-in-chief of the Austrian army, who had allowed himself to be shut up in the town with the larger part of his army. This unhappy general found himself reduced to the last extremities. He at first affected great courage and declared that he would eat his last horse before he would surrender. He had so entirely lost his head that he did not notice that in saying this he was confessing that the town was without provisions. He parleyed for several days unsuccessfully, thinking to save his honor and military reputation by proposals which could not stand a moment's examination. He was at last forced to sign a capitulation by the terms of which he agreed to surrender unless relieved within 6 days. The emperor being certain that Munich was in the hands of his troops, that the columns which had come out of Ulm were being pursued and beaten in every direction, that the Russians had not crossed the Inn, and that Mack had no chance of being rescued, consented to give him his satisfaction. Mack, however, shortened the term which he himself had asked for. On the 20th of October, from noon till 6 in the evening, the Austrian army shut up in Ulm, numbering 33,000 men, and under the commander-in-chief, 8 field marshals and 7 lieutenant generals, marched past the emperor. Arms were laid down, and the army was transported to France. The officers were allowed to remain in Austria on parole, not to serve against France until they had been exchanged. The first column of prisoners left the next day for France. The emperor treated the general officers well and deported himself toward the commander-in-chief with respect due to misfortune. He severely repressed certain humiliating remarks of which the vanquished had been the subject. On the 21st, a proclamation to the soldiers of the great army, congratulating them and announcing the immense success of this fortnight's campaign, was followed by a decree which ordered that the month which had just elapsed from September 22nd to October 24th would count as a campaign for the whole of the army. On the morrow of the day in which this glorious feat of arms was accomplished at Ulm, our navy met with a great disaster. Whilst our great army, led by the emperor routing his enemies on the continent, was forcing its triumphal way into Vienna, the splendid combined fleet, which, in protecting the passage of the flotilla across the channel at Bologna, was to realize such lofty hopes, met its doom at Trafalgar. It needed the glorious victory of Ulm and the prospect of the successful issue of the further operations which Napoleon had prepared to console him for a catastrophe which postponed indefinitely all hope of ruining the English fleet. The emperor felt that the only resource left to him was the execution of a vast continental blockade and extraordinary measures which would complete its effectiveness. The unhappy Villeneuve, the responsible author of the ruin of the expedition and the author of the disaster of Trafalgar, having fallen into the hands of the English and having been released by them, put an end to his life in a moment of despair. Of all the battles which preceded the entry of the French into Vienna, the one which took place at Dürnstein was the most remarkable because of the critical situation in which Marshal Mortier found himself, and from which he was fortunate enough to escape. The marshal, who was skirting the left bank of the Danube, engaged in the pursuit of the enemy in the narrow defile which at this place is formed by the river and the mountains, had only half his corps d'armée with him, the rest of his troops being disposed in echelons at 1 or 2 marches' distance. Mortier easily drove the enemy before him, but these were soon reinforced by superior troops. In the meanwhile, a Russian division had come down from the mountains behind him and had placed itself between his feeble corps and the Dupont division, which was following him. Mortier, thus shut in between two hostile forces, had no other alternative than to cut his way through them or to perish. In this extremity, he turned against the weaker enemy and charged the Russian division, which was pressing on in the rear, and was followed by the enemy, which he had previously attacked from the front. But at this moment, the scene changed. The Dupont division, which at the sound of the cannon had hurried up, came behind the Russian division, which was now caught between two fires from the French troops. This hostile division had only just time to make good its escape by the ravine, which they had followed in coming down the mountain, a retreat which would have been close to them if the Dupont division had been able to reach this ravine before they did. Marshal Mortier, having rallied this division, was now in a position to drive back the other Russian corps, which he previously had to resist in front. This corps of the French army owed its safety to the marshal's coolness and to the promptness of Dupont and the intrepidity of the officers and men. The emperor had halted at St. Polten, a village situated almost opposite Dürnstein, armed by the loud cannonade which echoed through the rocks. He did not leave St. Polten until he had received reassuring news of the Marshal Mortier and of the corps under his command.